Serious people who have survived a murder attempt by dumb luck. What's your story? Thank God for my nosy neighbors. I always used to hate how nosy they were. Until this happened. When I was about 10 I was riding my bike outside. My parents always let me ride my bike outside during the summer, but only up and down the street we were on. One day, a man in a van was parked across the street. He called to me, asking me if I had seen his dog and could help him find it. Me, being a dumb child, offered to help him find it, and I started walking towards his van. My neighbor, an older white lady, came bolting out of her house hooting and yelling, telling the guy to back off. The dude got back in his car in a hurry and took off, and it wasn't until many years later that I realized how bad that situation could have been. Did you tell your parents? How did they react? I didn't want to tell my parents, but my neighbor walked me home and made sure to tell my mother. She didn't let me go outside for what felt like the whole summer. There was a bit of yelling and hugging too, none of which I understood at the time. Now that I'm older, I completely understand my mother's reaction. When I was about 10 my grandfather was dying from complications of his heart issues and mental deterioration. I didn't know him very well as the last time we had been in contact him was when I was a baby. My father never liked him and didn't bother coming with me and my mother to visit him in the hospital. When we got there he was resting peacefully and my mother went forward and whispered some words to him, I imagine about his current state of health. I hang back a little bit because the creepy old guy whom I didn't recall seeing in my whole life really freaked me out. Regardless of my anxiety my mom said I should approach grandpa and share some nice words with him. I understood by how sad my mother was that I shouldn't argue too much, so I approached his hospital bed to speak to him. He didn't seem conscious at all, so I just did what my mother did, leaning forward and just whisper some nice things to him. Things took turn when mid-sentence his eyes flare open, and he stares at me making me stop what I'm saying. My heart dropped into my as when he looked at me because it was pure hatred in his eyes. As soon as we made eye contact he bolted upright from his bed and wrapped his hands around my neck and started throttling me as hard as he could. I barely even remember what happened, but my mom was screaming for a nurse. And grandpa kept yelling at me while shaking my neck violently FCKING betrayal you betray me, and then he died. Almost as fast as it began it was over. His grip loosened and he flatlined. My mother was inconsolable and I was extremely confused and crying out of sheer trauma at the situation. Later after we managed to calm down a nurse explained to my mother that his severe dementia had left him barely coherent and it was likely he had thought I was someone else. I didn't learn this until several years later, but my mother suspected my grandfather saw my father in me. My father was an alcoholic womanizer and fairly abusive in my earlier childhood and my grandfather resented him for it. I guess I look a little too much like my dad. My dad has a client that owns a number of fast food restaurants. One day we were working at one of his stores remodeling and talking about robberies. The client told us that when he was just getting into the fast food business, he lived in Colorado. He was assistant manager at a chain that required him to wear a tie. A drug addict came into the restaurant to rob them and grabbed him from behind, putting a knife to his throat. He opened the register and the guy attempted to slit his throat anyway, except the knife was dull and couldn't cut through the material of the tie. The client began to fight back and escaped with minor injuries. Addict went to prison and apparently he has the tie in a frame at home. Throw away because it got some media. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I was representing this guy that had embezzled almost $500K from his business partner. He was looking down the barrel at several years in prison. A bunch of his assets had been seized by the government, was being sued by multiple creditors for north of $2 million, and was in the midst of an ugly divorce, and wasn't allowed to see his kids. I was one of 3 lawyers he had: criminal, civil and divorce. He was drinking a lot and using coke. I used to get this incoherent phone calls in the middle of the night that ranged from threats to crying. He came to my office one day and asked for me, but I was in court. My secretary said he was perfectly civil. He then went to his divorce lawyer's office and shot him to death. Got stopped by the police a short distance away and was wounded in a shootout. He would later tell the cops that he had come to my office to shoot me that day and also planned to shoot his civil attorney. Why? You were presumably hired on to defend him, so why did he even do that? So confusing. He was not in a rational state of mind. People sometimes have a tendency to blame their lawyers when the situation isn't going to get resolved how they like. I know 2 other attorneys who have been assaulted or threatened with weapons by clients. I have a friend who had a party at his parents' house when he was in high school that a ton of random people went to. He got super drunk during the party and went upstairs to go to sleep, knowing that his friends would watch the party for him. My friend woke up from his nap to a guy from his school sitting on top of him stabbing him to death. He was stabbed 7 times before it stopped, and he laid there on the bed dying. The only reason he is still alive is because his best friend came upstairs to ask him if it was alright if he made a frozen pizza and found him. The assailant was put in jail and recently was released, and it scares me to know that a guy who wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone said during the trial is still out there free. There's a guy in my hometown named Bamboo Flute Blanchard, I'm not joking, who stabbed his father for the same reason. His family is kind of locally famous. They're a weird large hippie family. Anyway, news article said he told his brother he wanted to know what it would feel like to kill someone, picked up the knife and just waked on over and stabbed his dad. Also failed. Also made it out of jail pretty quickly. Again, weird family. Father wouldn't even speak to the police about it, and the young man has been in and out of jail / psych wards ever since on various low level and drug acid related stuff. Our neighbors when I was growing up had 3 kids the same ages as myself and my siblings. We were all friends and got along well for the most part. Their eldest child, I'll call him Peter, has Asperger's syndrome and was known to have outbursts that would sometimes be violent. One day, when I was 5 or 6, our mothers decided to take all 6 of us to a nearby wading pool because it was hot out. Well, due to that, it was pretty busy, and there were a lot of other kids. There were 2 lifeguards there, but were generally too busy chatting with each other to be doing their jobs, as my mother later tells me. I was off with my neighbor's daughter, was my age, and Peter. I don't remember why, but he suddenly flew into a fit and decided that I was at fault for something. He, being about 8 and a lot bigger than me, grabs my head and holds it under the water. I remember that. I remember not being able to breathe. I remember clearly thinking that I needed air or I was going to die. I remember fighting, but not being strong enough to get him off of me. Then I remember my mom's face. She had a clear look of both terror and fury. I remember looking over and seeing Peter sitting with his arms around his knees, rocking back and forth as his mother tried to calm him down. Then I remember my mom absolutely losing it on the lifeguards, who had missed everything and were clueless as to why this tiny woman was screaming at them that her daughter had almost drowned on their watch. To this day, I have a fear of swimming and absolutely do not like having water on my face, even when I'm showering. I hope those lifeguards were fired. Clearly they are incapable to do their job. I jumped out of a moving vehicle. This was in college in a different country. There were commuter buses that takes us to and from the campus and dorms. I had to stay 30 minutes later for a project, so around 7:30 p.m. by then the commuter rush was gone. I was the only passenger, and I was sitting at front next to the driver. He was acting already shady. It was dark and rainy. He made a sudden dark turn of a grass-lit hill. He said something's wrong with the tires. I said in getting off. He won't let me. The hill leads to a cliffside where rapes and murders have happened before. I had the pointy stick of my umbrella facing him ready to jab if he tried anything, which he tried to reach/grab for me. I jumped and ran straight to the highway where another commuter bus stopped, surprised seeing a girl coming out of the tall grasses. I saw the driver of my previous ride speeding away. Nothing was wrong with his tires. I was abducted at a gas station during undergrad. The locks on my car were broken, and as soon as I got back in, a strange man came in and forced me to drive him to an ATM. I'm paralyzed with fear, so any sense or reason I had went out the window. He claimed he worked at Wendy's, and for my generosity he would give me all the Wendy's I ever wanted. On the way to the ATM he showed me pictures of his daughters on his clearly stolen cell phone. Then a Whitney Houston song came on the radio and he starts bawling his eyes out and screaming, why do all the good people have to die? Only bad things should happen to bad people. I go to the ATM, take out cash, give it to him thinking it's over. He then makes me get back in the car and drive him somewhere else. We pass by some train tracks and I'm thinking this is it. This is where I will be murdered. He asks me what I'm studying in school and I tell him biochemistry. I believe in jet propulsion and all that shit. We are not alone, aliens are among us. He then makes me pull over at a gas station and he tells me drive away sweetheart. I call the cops, had to do a lineup. Apparently this dude had done this to a ton of other women and some were less unscathed than I was.